we want to dig a little further into how constructivism relates to the approaches that we've already been talking about earlier in the course. How do they relate to one another? So we stressed previously this basic tension or contradiction or argument between constructivism and all the other three that we talked about previously: realism, liberalism, economic structuralism. Those schools of thought all focused on hard factors like money, military power, whereas constructivism focuses on shared ideas and beliefs, right? Things that you can't go knock your hand on very easily. So we've focused on this idea of competition or contradiction. But there are some respects, and I raised this in the question I closed the last presentation with, about the idea that constructivism can be a complement as opposed to a contradiction to these other schools of thought. And a big part of that is if those schools of thought sort of assume interests and have really powerful ways of deducing the impact of different kinds of interests, what constructivism can do, at least in some people's views, is become a more persuasive way of accounting for interests, and especially changing interests, than the assumptions that are built into those other theories. In other words, constructivism can be seen as really focusing in on something that those other schools don't really emphasize very much, and therefore it's seen as being complementary. And let me give some examples in a little more detail. So first, to talk about constructivism and liberalism. Liberals tend to like constructivism because all this focus on norms and shared identities and so on, for liberals, provide arguments to say, see, the prisoner's dilemma is not impossible to solve, right? I mentioned the case of prisoners who are, parts of organized crime gangs, at least as the way they're presented on TV, with strong norms about cooperating with one another. In lots of different places, right? Cheating or not cheating is considered an important element of your identity. States as well as individuals like to think of themselves as being honest and being trustworthy and having others see them as trustworthy. All of these things, from a liberal's perspective, are evidence or are reason to believe that solving the security dilemma or the prisoner's dilemma is really not as hard as the realists would have us believe. Moving on to economic structuralism, we talked about this a little bit already, right? This idea that identities and norms help explain why capitalism persists despite its inequities, because that's, of course, a big question for economic structuralists and Marxists of all stripes. So, for example, and both Marx and, but especially Lenin, made a huge deal out of this, that nationalism is a way that the elites, so the capitalists of the world, divide the workers from one another, right? Instead of seeing themselves as part of the same working class, in World War I, right, the capitalists of Europe, in Lenin's view, got the German working people and the English people, working people, to see themselves as enemies. And when they see themselves as enemies, Lenin said, who wins but the capitalists? And a lot of people would say they would see the same kind of thing today in the inability to really forge a global transnational labor movement. Liberalism, all the doctrines of liberalism, or to go a step further, what is often called neoliberalism, is seen as an ideology, right? It's nothing you can really knock on or put your finger on, neoliberalism, but it's seen as an ideology that had people not asking certain questions and thinking the answers to other questions were obvious in ways that help preserve capitalism and exploitation. Similarly, consumerism, right? The fetish with getting more stuff, more belongings, and so on, is seen as a way that an advertising industry sort of helps capitalists enslave us to not only the need for more things, but to the debt that goes with buying those things and keeps us dependent on them. So in that sense, when it's viewed in this way, constructivism is not entirely different from post-structural Marxism. Realism might seem to be a little bit of a tougher sell for constructivism. But one of the early realists, E.H. Carr, who wrote a fabulous book way back in 1939 and was one of the real important theorists of modern realism, basically said, if you don't have an understanding of where interests come from and how they change, you really don't have much of a theory. His point, or to put it differently, was that power, which is what realists focus on so much, power is great, but it doesn't tell you what you should do with it. And unless you have an understanding or a theory of what power should be used for, you don't have much of a policy or an explanation for policy. And constructivists would say, yep, and that's what we can add to realism, is a real understanding of how states define national interests, but also how states sometimes define shared interests. Other very important theorists, and Henry Kissinger in this second example was an important scholar before he was a policymaker, and now he's just a very old lobbyist. But he basically argued that the key question is, do the main powers in the system accept the status quo or accept the existing order? And he introduced this category of status quo versus revisionist powers. And he argued that the long piece of the 19th century came about because all of those powers accepted the basic order of things in Europe as acceptable and as something they wanted to support. And when he sees Germany before World War I becoming a revisionist power, and that ruins the peace in Europe. Similarly, Kissinger argued that as long as the US and the Soviet Union didn't accept the status quo after World War II, and particularly he argued that the Soviet Union was trying to overthrow the post-World War II status quo, you had a very dangerous, unstable situation. Kissinger argued that by around the 1970s, the Soviets came to view the status quo as pretty favorable to them. And so once the Soviets were happy with the status quo, he argued you had a new stability in the US-Soviet relationship. A much more recent argument is from a guy who's now dead, called Samuel Huntington. And Huntington wrote this famous article in a book called The Clash of Civilizations. And he essentially was arguing that, well, if the Cold War is over and we're not going to have clashes that are about geopolitics or that are about ideology anymore, what we're now going to have is clash of identities. Right? And he had this big thing about Western versus Asian versus African versus Orthodox. And a lot of people think that it's basically bunk. But nonetheless, I want to stress it because it's gotten a lot of attention around the world. The idea that conflict nowadays is about identity, not about anything material. Frankly, I think you can maybe apply that to some of what goes on in U.S. domestic politics. So, question to end with is constructivism more valuable as an alternative to other schools of thought or as a complement to them?